Now, he won't thank me for putting it this way, but if there is a saint walking around in progressive politics anywhere today, it's Chris Hedges. A saintly, educated, calm, cool, and collected voice of experience on war and high politics, high crimes and misdemeanors. In a sane America, he'd be pretty near the president's desk at the White House. At least he'd be at Foggy Bottom as the Secretary of State. Instead, Chris Hedges has just been cancelled from yet another gig, yet another platform. But he'll never, ever be cancelled from the mother of all talk shows. Chris Hedges, welcome. Before we get on to the big stuff, the important, more important stuff like ceasefires, war, famine, pestilence, and disease, what have they done to you now?
Well, the primary funder of the Real News is a guy named T.M. Scruggs, who told the Real News that if they did anything, in his eyes, to elect Donald Trump, they would lose their funding. That is just an inverted way of saying support Joe Biden and the Democrats. I have a long history with Scruggs. He had given money to Scheer Post, the website run by Bob Scheer. I had written a column defending the writer Alice Walker against charges that she was an anti-Semite. Scruggs demanded the column be removed. He was a major donor. And then when Bob Scheer refused to remove it, he cut off all contributions to the site. So the editor of The Real News, Max Alvarez, said that I was canceled because I jeopardized his nonprofit status. That is completely untrue. What happened was I interviewed Dennis Kucinich, former member of the House, former presidential candidate, anti-war candidate, who is running for a House seat as an independent in Ohio. I did not endorse him, which would have violated nonprofits. So I did not violate the rules. And what happened was that interview was removed from the site, and then my show was immediately terminated. That's the problem with wealthy, rich people or corporations running news sites. They distort, corrupt the truth, the news, whether that's on MSNBC, where every analyst discussing the police assaults on U.S. universities for non-violent protest, arresting students for trespassing on their own campuses, come from the police agencies or the security forces. So I got caught up in it. I'll have to, establish something now that is completely independent. As you said, I was pushed out of the New York Times for denouncing the war in Iraq when the wealthy publisher of Truthdig tried to fire the editor, Bob Scheer. I organized a strike among all the staff except for two of them, and then we were all fired. It's not a new story, but the walls are really closing in. There's just less and less possibility for legitimate criticism, legitimate dissent, and honest journalism.
Well, let us know what it is you decide to do next, and we will, of course, do our best to direct people your way. Let's turn to the proximate issue of a ceasefire in Gaza. You're a former head of the Middle East Bureau at the New York Times, as you say, before being fired for telling the truth, questioning the lies. What's your take? Is there a ceasefire coming or not?
It's always hard because, I'm not in Cairo covering the negotiations, but from a distance, I think it's clear that nothing is going to impede the Israeli assault on Rafah, ceasefire or no ceasefire. I think that if we look at all of the negotiations around the ceasefires, Israel has been the primary impediment to, despite what Anthony Blinken says about Hamas, that it's been Israel that's essentially stymied any effort to a ceasefire because they've sold out their own hostages. They have decided that those hostages are expendable to pursue their campaign of genocide. So if I had to take a guess, I would say if there is a ceasefire, it won't last long, because I think that Netanyahu and his government is very, very serious about going into Rafah, and all the signs are that that is sooner rather than later.
There was a major operation by the Palestinian resistance in Gaza this afternoon. Seems to have been a remarkably accurate strike with many deaths and casualties amongst the Israeli occupation force. That would seem to suggest that the resistance is far from broken in Gaza. Is that your interpretation too?
Not just mine, but it's the interpretation of the American intelligence community, which estimates, according to press reports, that only a third of the resistance forces have been destroyed, and that the resistance forces, and in particular Hamas, have a capacity to continue fighting for a few more months, which I find surprising, because I'm sure that the Egyptian border, by which they once were able to get munitions and weapons smuggled in through tunnels, has been completely sealed off. So it looks like not only has the Netanyahu government completely failed in what are we pushing 7 months now of war to wipe out war. Shouldn't call it a war. 7 months of genocide to wipe out Hamas, but that they remain very resilient and are able, as you just point out, to carry out very significant attacks against the occupation forces. I think we have to remember that in a modern battlefield, people can be grievously wounded, wounds that in other wars would have seen them die, but they can be transported very quickly to hospitals inside Israel. But the stories are that although the death count is not terribly high for the Israelis, we have thousands and thousands of Israeli soldiers who are very grievously wounded, and Israel is doing all it can to essentially hide those numbers.
Now, even if Netanyahu wanted an end to the war, and plainly he does not, people like Ben Gvir and other right-wing, even more right-wing fanatic extremists are holding the Israeli government's feet to the fire, aren't they? For them, and Ben Gvir said literally in these words this afternoon, we are not interested in a hostage deal. We must invade Rafah now. That means that the policies of Western governments, many of which would describe themselves as liberals, social democrats, liberals in Western Europe, in North America, Trudeau, Biden, their policy is being driven by people who were literally on the terrorist lists just a couple of years ago, like Ben Gvir.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, and these are heirs of Meir Kahane, the extreme right-wing rabbi. But this shows the shift from liberal Zionism, which meted out severe repression of the Palestinians, just like religious Zionism. But it shows that shift. The language, it's more a shift of language. I think the intent was always there, but liberal Zionism provided a better veneer. The liberal Zionists ultimately banned Kahane's Koch party, but these people are all the heirs to Kahane, and perhaps they speak more truthfully than the liberal Zionists, because I don't think that replacing Bibi Netanyahu would make any difference for the Palestinians. I don't think replacing Bibi Netanyahu would halt an assault on Rafah. I think that there are arguments over whether Netanyahu should be prime minister, especially for the egregious security and intelligence lapses of October 7th, not to mention Netanyahu's documented corruption. But in terms of the genocidal campaign. We know from polls within Israel it has full-throated support from the vast majority of the Israeli population and the entirety of the Israeli ruling class.
You know, it's important. We always accuse the other side of living in a bubble, and they do, but it's important we don't live in a bubble either, isn't it? I looked back at a documentary around the killings of 4 students in America at the Kent State University in 1970, the height of the anti-Vietnam War campaign. And they did a lot of vox pops in the vicinity of the campus, the neighbors of the students, the parents of many of the students at that university, who invariably said to the camera that the troopers should have shot more of them. The troopers should have wiped out the protesters at Kent State. I mean, blood-curdling it was. What's the attitude, in your view, in Middle America to us, grotesque spectacle of soldiers, for that's what many of them were, with high-powered rifles and armor, beating the hell out of elderly professors and young kids sitting in at their own university over the last couple of weeks?
Well, we've got to look at how the media portrays it, and I'm including the quote-unquote liberal media, the New York Times, my former employer, MSNBC. So they've completely distorted the narrative. These groups are painted not as groups that attempt to protest the genocide, but as groups that are threatening Jews and Jewish students and calling for the destruction of Israel. When the police were green-lighted to go in, sometimes with guns drawn, on students at Columbia, the excuse was that these groups were being led by infiltrators and outside agitators. Joe Biden has called them hate groups. Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, head of the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, has called them terrorists, has said that they were terrorists. So, and the media has just amplified that caricature of the students. And that was also true, of course, during the war in Vietnam. So the propaganda engine is fierce. It is unrelenting in terms of demonizing. There's just one story, just as, you know, we get a constant replay of October 7th with all sorts of lies, beheaded babies and systematic rape, all of which is not true, to justify the genocide. We get an assault of lies on a daily basis that mischaracterize the students, what they're doing, what they stand for. I mean, I was just up at Columbia, and I've spent a lot of time with the Princeton encampment. I live in Princeton. About 40%, I'm estimating, of these protesters are Jewish. And in fact, the worst kinds of assaults, the fear, when we talk about fear on campus, is felt by non-Zionist Jews from their Zionist counterparts. Remember, a lot of these campuses like Columbia have current or former IDF soldiers as students, and we had students attacked with skunk spray violently by 3 former IDF soldiers on the steps of Low Library at Columbia in January. It is such a massive distortion of the truth that of course these people in Middle America who are unfortunately believe what they're told are whipped up into a kind of a hatred and a kind of support for this militarized occupation. I mean, we've had universities where snipers have been deployed on the roofs. We had when the NYPD went in to the second-story window and this machine, I don't know what it's called, but a ramp that went up to the window, they had their guns drawn. In fact, they fired a gun. They used They used smoke grenades. I mean, the students were beaten. When several went to the hospital, one was beaten unconscious. It's just staggering. But you're right. And that comes from the complicity of the press in essentially not only justifying the genocide, but justifying armed assault against nonviolent protesters who are opposing the genocide.
You ever lose faith, Chris?
No, I come out of Calvin. I have a very dark view of human nature. I lose faith when people. So I've spent a lot of time actually writing a very long piece. Probably have spent 12 hours interviewing student activists, including students at Princeton who have gone on a hunger strike. And you can't sit with them and lose faith. They're sacrificing their careers, their education. It's hard to get into these schools like Princeton and Columbia. Their parents are not happy. For undergraduates, I mean, they said, we, at least the graduate students, still have a degree. If we're expelled, we don't even have a college degree. And when you spend time with them, you don't lose faith. I mean, they and the Yemenis are the two groups that have finally stood up in a meaningful way against severe repression and against a legitimate fear that their academic careers will be completely sabotaged.
Finally, there's no point in wasting words on Joe Biden. I think we're beyond that. But what did you make of Trump's unhinged speech yesterday, in which he appeared to threaten the deportation of Americans if they oppose Israel? And anyone who tries to destroy Israel, he said, will be destroyed by us. He seemed to be threatening, I don't know, a kind of mass capital punishment in America for Israel's enemies. It's like a Dutch auction, isn't it? Where everyone competes to see who can be the most slavish, the most vile supporters of the worst acts since the Second World War.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, we do have to take Trump's rhetoric with a grain of salt. He can rhetorically go to places that, in fact, he doesn't ultimately go. I mean, the tragedy of this current presidential election is that we, as Americans, are offered a choice between a candidate who is actively pursuing genocide and a candidate who will probably snuff out what is left of our very anemic democracy. I don't consider that much of a moral choice. So, I mean, there's very little daylight, ultimately, between Trump and Biden. For a Palestinian, there's no daylight. There would be no difference whether Trump was in the White House or Biden. And internally, there's very little daylight, given the draconian use of force that has been carried out in campuses across this country. I mean, when I was up at Columbia the other day, that campus is on complete lockdown. It's completely surrounded, not only surrounded by police and private security, but occupied internally by New York City police. No student can go into that campus unless they live in a residence hall on the inside of campus. There are no classes. They can't go to labs. They can't go to the library. It's a Potemkin university. It doesn't really exist anymore. And I don't think that Trump, Biden, I don't think there'd be much difference in terms of the repression that has been meted out on these university campuses. I mean, the next step would be perhaps like Kent State, shooting protesters, shooting demonstrators. But we've walked all the way up to that line.
Chris Hedges, keep on keeping on. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Chris Hedges, political commentator, journalist, writer, and host of the Chris Hedges Report.